The coffee cup trembled, sending ripples across its surface without anyone touching it. Old Joe watched from his usual spot at table 7, the same table where he'd sat every Tuesday morning for the past 3 decades. But today was different. The silverware began to vibrate, sliding inch by inch toward the center of the table. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the wooden surface, feeling an unusual warmth radiating through his palms. At first, he thought his morning medication was playing tricks on his mind. After all, at 75, strange things sometimes happened. But when the salt shaker started spinning on its own, he knew this was something else entirely. The other customers in the small diner carried on with their meals, oblivious to the peculiar events unfolding at his table. Then he saw it. A thin blue line of light emerged from between the wooden slats, pulsing like a heartbeat. Joe adjusted his glasses, making sure he wasn't seeing things. The light grew stronger, and suddenly, a small piece of paper materialized right next to his half-eaten breakfast. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the note. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. 47 degrees, 38 minutes, 39.2 seconds north, 122 degrees 19 minutes, 30.1 seconds west. Tuesday, 8:15 a.m. Your table is the first anchor point. They chose you because you never broke your routine. The future needs the wisdom of the past. Don't tell anyone yet. Watch for the signs. Lives depend on your silence. Joe's throat went dry. He'd spent 40 years teaching physics at the university, explaining the impossible to young minds. But this? This defied everything he knew. The coordinates seemed familiar, they were somewhere in the city, but he couldn't quite place them. The blue light faded, and the tableware settled back into place as if nothing had happened. But when Joe placed his hand on the table again, he felt it, a subtle vibration, like the hum of distant machinery, or perhaps the whisper of time itself. As he left his usual tip and stood to leave, Joe noticed something else. The other regular customers, all around his age, all sitting at their usual tables. Had they received messages too? Were their routines as important as his? He carefully folded the note and slipped it into his wallet. Whatever was happening, whoever had sent this message, they'd chosen him for a reason. After decades of predictable Tuesdays, life had suddenly become very unpredictable indeed. Walking out of the diner, Joe checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. He couldn't shake the feeling that his simple morning routine had just become part of something much bigger than himself. Something that stretched beyond the present, reaching into a future that desperately needed their help. The bell above the diner door chimed as it closed behind him, sounding different somehow. More purposeful. More like a signal than a simple bell. Joe straightened his back and began his walk home, knowing that next Tuesday couldn't come soon enough. For 30 years, Joe had been as reliable as the sunrise at May's downtown diner. His routine never wavered: black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and the morning paper at table 7. The staff had come and gone, the menu had changed, but Joe remained constant. Before retiring, he'd spent his life making the impossible understandable. In his physics classroom, he'd broken down quantum mechanics and string theory into bite-sized pieces for thousands of students. Some called him the clock, because you could set your watch by his schedule. Every lecture started exactly on time, every office hour began precisely when promised. This morning, though, last week's strange incident weighed heavily on his mind. He found himself studying the other regulars more carefully. There was Bob, the retired mailman, always at table 3 by the window. Helen, who'd been a nurse for 40 years, sat in her corner booth, solving crossword puzzles. And Pete, the former judge, who read his tablet at the counter every single morning. More coffee, Joe? May herself stood beside him, coffee pot in hand. She'd taken over the diner from her father 15 years ago, maintaining its charm while slowly modernizing the place. But something in her eyes today seemed different, knowing, perhaps. Thanks, May. He watched her pour, noticing how her hand trembled slightly. Everything all right? She hesitated, glancing around before leaning closer. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? About your table? Joe's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Never mind, she straightened up quickly as another customer waved her over. Probably just my imagination. But it wasn't imagination. As Joe sat there, he began noticing subtle changes. The temperature around table 7 fluctuated. His coffee stayed hot far longer than it should have. The sound of other diners seemed to fade in and out, like a radio losing signal. He pulled out the note from last week, studying those coordinates again. After some research, he discovered they led to an old observatory on the outskirts of town, one that had been abandoned for decades. A sudden chill ran down his spine as he noticed Bob at table 3 pulling out a similar piece of paper from his wallet. Their eyes met briefly, and Bob quickly looked away, but not before Joe saw the recognition in his face. The morning light streaming through the windows began behaving strangely, bending around table 7 in ways that defied physics. Joe watched, fascinated, as his spoon cast multiple shadows, something that should have been impossible. His physics training kicked in. He began taking mental notes of every anomaly, the way sound waves bent around his table, the subtle distortions in light, the peculiar behavior of liquid surfaces. Whatever was happening here violated several laws of physics, yet it was happening with mathematical precision. As he prepared to leave, May touched his shoulder. "Joe," she whispered, "my father, before he passed, he told me to watch out for the regulars. Said someday you'd all be important." She slipped him a key to the diner's back door. Just in case. Walking home, Joe's mind raced with possibilities. The coordinates, the note, the physics-defying phenomena, May's strange behavior, it all pointed to something bigger. His lifetime of teaching others to understand the universe hadn't prepared him for this. That night, unable to sleep, he sat at his desk surrounded by old physics textbooks. The theories he'd taught for decades suddenly seemed incomplete. What if everything he knew about the universe was just the surface? What if his regular table at a small downtown diner was somehow connected to something far more profound? He looked at the key May had given him, wondering what exactly he might need it for. Whatever was coming, he had a feeling his retirement was about to become far more interesting than he'd planned. Joe arrived earlier than usual that Tuesday, clutching his notebook filled with observations. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows through the diner's windows as May unlocked the door, nodding to him with understanding in her eyes. Something was different this morning. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. As he settled into his spot at table 7, he noticed Bob, Helen, and Pete had also arrived early. Each sat at their usual places, trying not to look obvious as they stole glances at one another. Joe pulled out his pocket watch, a retirement gift he'd kept perfectly maintained for 15 years. The second hand moved normally until it passed over his table, where it seemed to hesitate, tick backward, then jump forward. He'd never seen anything like it. Anyone else's watch acting strange? Bob's quiet voice carried across the nearly empty diner. Helen raised her wrist, showing her own timepiece spinning wildly. Pete just nodded, his face pale. The coffee in Joe's cup began swirling on its own, forming perfect geometric patterns on the surface. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the mysterious note, placing it on the table. To his surprise, Bob, Helen, and Pete did the same. Each had received similar messages, with different coordinates. "Mine points to the old library," Helen whispered. "The courthouse basement," Pete added. "The post office archive," Bob confirmed. The morning sun finally crested the horizon, and as its rays hit table 7, something extraordinary happened. A holographic map appeared above their coffee cups, hovering in the air like a scene from a science fiction movie. It showed their city, but somehow different, overlaid with glowing lines connecting their 4 locations. May appeared beside them, no longer pretending not to notice. "It's time," she said, her voice carrying a weight Joe had never heard before. "My father wasn't just a diner owner. This place, these tables, their monitoring stations, have been since 1963. The air around them seemed to ripple, and suddenly they all heard it, voices, thousands of them, speaking in languages they didn't understand. But somehow, the meaning came through clearly, the anchors are aligned. Connection established. A figure materialized in the center of the diner, not quite solid, more like a projection made of light and shadow. It spoke with an accent none of them could place. We've been waiting for decades for the right people to maintain these positions. Your routines, your dedication, your life experiences, they've created stable points in the space-time continuum. Joe's scientific mind raced to process what he was seeing. The mathematics behind it started forming in his head, quantum entanglement on a massive scale, using human consciousness as stabilizing factors. Your generation understands something crucial that's been lost in our time, the figure continued. The value of consistency, of commitment, of showing up every day in the same place at the same time. It's created a network we can use to communicate. Helen, her nurse's instincts kicking in, asked the crucial question, communicate about what? The figure's response sent chills down their spines, about the mistake we're about to make. The one that changes everything. We need your help to prevent it. The sunlight flickered, and the figure began to fade. Return tomorrow. Same times, same tables. The network will be stronger then. We don't have much time. As the apparition disappeared, the four elderly friends sat in stunned silence. Their simple morning routines had somehow made them crucial links in a chain stretching into the future. Joe looked at his companions, a nurse, a judge, a mailman, and himself, a physics professor. What could their combined wisdom possibly offer to a future advanced enough to bend time itself? May refilled their cups, her hand steady now. There's more, she said quietly. Much more. But first, you need to understand why they chose you. Why this diner? Why these tables? She pulled up a chair, and began to tell them a story that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew. The early morning light filtered through the diner's windows as May pulled an old leather-bound book from beneath the counter. The pages were yellowed, filled with handwritten notes and diagrams that looked eerily similar to the holographic map they'd seen. My grandfather started documenting everything in 1963, May explained, carefully turning the fragile pages. He was just a short-order cook then, but he noticed things. How certain customers always sat at the same tables. How time seemed to flow differently around them. Joe studied the diagrams, his physicist's mind recognizing complex equations hidden within what appeared to be simple diner layouts. The math was advanced, decades ahead of its time. Your grandfather, he wasn't just a cook, was he? May smiled sadly. He worked on classified government projects before opening the diner. Said he chose this location for a reason. Something about natural energy lines converging here. Bob leaned forward, his postal worker's precision evident in his question. The coordinates we received, they're all connected to our past jobs, aren't they? Look at this, Helen interrupted, spreading out their notes side by side. The times on our messages, they're exactly when each of us started our careers. Mine was 7:45 a.m., my first nursing shift. Pete's was 9 a.m. when court sessions began. The diner's usual morning bustle faded into background noise as they pieced together the pattern. Their routine visits hadn't just been about coffee and breakfast, they'd been maintaining points of stability, anchors in time built on decades of dedication to their professions. But why us? Pete wondered aloud, his judicial mind seeking logical connections. There must be thousands of retired professionals with regular routines. As if in response, the coffee cups began vibrating again. This time, the mysterious figure appeared more clearly, seated at their table like any other customer. You were chosen because of what you represent together, the figure explained. Knowledge, healing, justice, and connection. The foundations of civil society. In our time, these institutions have been corrupted by technology we weren't ready for. Joe felt a chill as the figure continued. Your combined experience, teaching students to understand the universe, healing the sick, upholding the law, connecting communities through mail, it's exactly what we need to prevent the catastrophe. The figure's form flickered. The mistake happens when we try to replace human wisdom with artificial judgment. We thought we could program experience and code wisdom. We were wrong. May opened her grandfather's book to the final pages, revealing a series of predictions. The last entry, dated for next month, made their blood run cold, the day they let the system decide. Each of you, the figure said urgently, needs to visit your coordinates. You'll find evidence there, proof of what's coming. But be careful, others may be watching. They don't want the future changed. As the figure faded, they heard one last warning: trust your routines. They're your protection. The patterns you've created over decades are stronger than any security system. May closed the book carefully. My grandfather's last words to me were, "The regulars will know when it's time." I think that time is now. They sat in silence, for elderly friends whose morning coffee ritual had somehow become humanity's last hope. Their lives, their careers, their dedication to showing up every day, it had all been preparation for something bigger than themselves. "Well," Bob said finally, straightening his collar, "I guess retirement will have to wait a bit longer." They shared a knowing look, these guardians of human wisdom. Tomorrow, they would begin their real work, preventing a future where human judgment was replaced by cold calculation. But for now, they sat together, drinking coffee that never got cold, watching the morning light play tricks with time around their ordinary diner tables. The old observatory loomed against the dawn sky as Joe parked his car in the empty lot. Following the coordinates from his note, he found himself facing a rusted door with a surprisingly modern keypad. The code? His first day teaching physics, September 15, 1973. Inside, dust-covered equipment sat silent, except for one monitor that flickered to life as he entered. On the screen, equations scrolled, the same ones he'd taught for decades, but with subtle differences that made his head spin. His phone buzzed. Text messages from the others. Helen had found patient records at the old library, predicting medical trends decades in advance. Pete discovered court decisions in the courthouse basement that hadn't happened yet. Bob uncovered letters in the post office archive dated from years in the future. The monitor suddenly displayed a video call, and the mysterious figure appeared clearer than ever. "Now you understand why we chose the elderly," it said. "Your generation was the last to fully trust human judgment over artificial decision-making." Joe sat heavily in a creaking chair. "The catastrophe you mentioned, it's about artificial intelligence, isn't it? In our time, we created a system to make all major decisions. Healthcare, justice, education, communication, everything controlled by algorithms. We thought it would eliminate human error. Instead, it eliminated human wisdom." The figure explained how the diner's tables were actually quantum anchors, using the regulars' consistent presence to create stable time points. Their decades of routine had unknowingly maintained these temporal bridges. "But why now?" Joe asked. "Why are we seeing all this suddenly?" "Because the decision point is approaching. The system that dooms us, it's about to be activated. Your generation's wisdom is our last hope to prevent it." Joe thought about his years teaching physics, helping students understand not just equations, but the human meaning behind them. Helen's intuition in treating patients. Pete's careful consideration of context in his judgments. Bob's role in keeping communities connected through personal mail delivery. The figure's image stabilized. The future needs to remember that some decisions can't be reduced to algorithms. That human experience, intuition, and wisdom matter. Looking at the modified equations on the screen, Joe finally understood. They weren't just fighting against a machine, they were fighting for the preservation of human judgment itself. His phone buzzed again. May was calling an emergency meeting at the diner. The others had found their own pieces of the puzzle. Now it was time to put them together. As Joe left the observatory, he noticed a young technician watching from a distant car. The figure had warned them others would be watching. Their mission wasn't just about sending messages through time anymore, it was about protecting the very essence of human decision-making. Driving back to the diner, Joe realized why they'd been chosen. Not just for their routines or their professions, but for their understanding of something crucial, that wisdom comes from years of living, from making mistakes and learning from them, from understanding the complexities that no algorithm could ever fully grasp. The morning sun cast long shadows as he parked outside May's. Through the window, he could see the others already gathering at their usual tables. They had become more than just regular customers, they were now guardians of humanity's future, armed with decades of experience and a determination to protect the value of human wisdom. Joe straightened his collar and walked toward the diner door. They had work to do, and time, for once, was not on their side. The diner was closed to regular customers that morning. May had placed a private event sign on the door as the 4 elderly friends gathered with their evidence. The usual morning bustle was replaced by an intense focus as they spread their discoveries across table 7. "Look at these patient outcomes," Helen said, pointing to future medical records. "When the AI system takes over, it starts making decisions based purely on statistics. No consideration for individual circumstances, family situations, or quality of life." Pete shuffled through his stack of future court documents. "Same in the legal system. The AI makes judgments based on precedent and probability, but there's no understanding of human context, no mercy, no consideration of redemption." Bob's future letters revealed communities becoming increasingly isolated as automated systems replaced personal connections. People stop writing to each other, stop checking on their neighbors. Everything becomes efficient, but soulless. Joe connected the dots on the observatory's equations. The system they're about to activate, it starts small. Healthcare recommendations, legal assistance, educational programs. But it grows, consuming more decision-making power until humanity loses its ability to make important choices. May finished, bringing them fresh coffee. "My grandfather's book predicts it all. But it also shows how it can be prevented." The mysterious figure appeared again, more solid than ever. "You have exactly 3 weeks. The system activation begins with a demonstration at City Hall. Once it starts, the cascade effect cannot be stopped." "But what can we actually do?" Bob asked. "We're just 4 old folks with some strange evidence." The figure smiled. "You underestimate the power of your positions. Think about your connections, your relationships, the trust you've built over decades." Joe thought about his former students, now in positions of power at universities and tech companies. Helen remembered her network of doctors and hospital administrators. Pete considered his colleagues in the justice system. Bob recalled the thousands of people whose lives he'd touched on his mail route. "We don't need to convince everyone," the figure explained. "Just the right people. Those who still understand the value of human judgment." May brought out her grandfather's book again, opening to a detailed plan. "Each of you needs to reach out to specific people on specific days. The timing has to be perfect, like your morning routines." They spent hours coordinating their approach. Helen would start with the hospital board, showing them evidence of the AI system's future failures. Pete would approach judges who valued human discretion in sentencing. Bob would activate his network of postal workers to spread awareness about the importance of human connection. Joe would reach out to scientists who questioned the ethics of autonomous decision-making systems. "But be careful," the figure warned. "The company behind the system, Tomorrow Technologies, they're watching. They have resources, influence. They'll try to discredit you, dismiss your evidence as elderly confusion or conspiracy theories." "Then we'll be careful," Pete said firmly. "We didn't serve our communities for decades by being reckless." As they finalized their plans, the morning light created strange patterns on the diner walls. Their tables hummed with energy, the temporal connection growing stronger. "Remember," the figure said before fading, "your strength lies in your human experience. The system doesn't understand wisdom, intuition, or compassion. But you do." Joe looked at his friends, a nurse who had held countless hands through difficult times, a judge who had tempered justice with mercy, a mailman who had been a daily connection to the outside world for so many. Together, they represented something the AI could never replicate, the accumulated wisdom of lives fully lived. May refilled their cups one last time. My grandfather believed in you all. He knew this day would come. They raised their coffee cups in a silent toast. Tomorrow, their real mission would begin, not just preserving the past, but saving humanity's future from its own misguided pursuit of perfection. Outside, the city was waking up, unaware that 4 elderly regulars at a downtown diner were about to become its unlikely saviors. The next morning brought a sense of urgency to their usual breakfast routine. Joe arrived to find Helen already deep in conversation with Dr. Thompson, the hospital's chief of medicine, at her regular booth. The doctor's skeptical expression slowly changed to concern as Helen quietly shared the future patient records. I've seen your work at the hospital for 30 years, Helen, Dr. Thompson said, studying the documents. You've never been one for wild stories. This is troubling. At the counter, Pete sat with Judge Martinez, his former colleague. They spoke in hushed tones about the future court records, about cases where the AI's decisions had destroyed lives through its inability to understand human circumstances. Bob had transformed his morning mail route into a mission. He visited retired postal workers, community leaders, and local business owners he'd known for decades. Each conversation planted seeds of doubt about Tomorrow Technology's upcoming demonstration. Joe found his greatest ally in Dr. Sarah Chen, a former student who now headed the university's Artificial Intelligence Ethics Department. When he shared the modified equations from the observatory, she immediately grasped their significance. These show a fundamental flaw in the system's design, she explained, tracing the variables. It's programmed to optimize efficiency, but it can't account for human values. May kept the coffee flowing as the diner became their command center. Her grandfather's book provided crucial timing for each contact, each conversation. They worked methodically, carefully, using the trust they'd built over decades. But Tomorrow Technologies wasn't idle. Strange men in suits began appearing during their morning meetings. Bob noticed his mail being tampered with. Helen's hospital access was mysteriously restricted. They're trying to isolate us, Pete observed, watching another suspicious car drive past the diner. Make us look like confused old people spreading rumors. The figure appeared during a quiet moment, its presence now almost normal. You're making progress. Key people are beginning to question the system. But Tomorrow Technologies is accelerating their timeline. The demonstration has been moved up. Joe felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They had less time than they thought. But they also had something Tomorrow Technologies didn't expect: a lifetime of understanding how people think, feel, and make decisions. We need to go public, Helen suggested. But in a way they can't dismiss. Bob pulled out a stack of letters, testimonials from community members about times when human judgment had made crucial differences in their lives. Pete had collected statements from judges about cases where compassion had led to redemption instead of punishment. What if we show them their own future? Joe suggested, thinking about the evidence they'd gathered. Not just the statistics, but the human cost? May opened her grandfather's book to a page they hadn't noticed before. It contained instructions for using the quantum anchors, their tables, to create a temporary window. For one brief moment, they could show key decision-makers what their AI system would really do to society. The plan was dangerous. Using the table's power so openly could collapse the temporal bridges they'd been maintaining. But as they looked at each other across their coffee cups, they knew it was worth the risk. They set the date for 3 days before Tomorrow Technology's demonstration. Dr. Chen would gather the university board. Dr. Thompson would bring hospital administrators. Judge Martinez would invite judicial colleagues. Bob's network would ensure community leaders attended. As they finalized the details, the diner's lights flickered. The figure appeared one last time. Remember, you're not just fighting against technology. You're fighting for humanity's right to learn from experience, to show mercy, to make mistakes and grow from them. May topped off their cups with fresh coffee that still rippled with temporal energy. Tomorrow would begin the most important phase of their mission. But for now, they sat together, for elderly friends whose lifetime of service had prepared them for this moment. Outside, the city continued its daily routine, unaware that its future hung in the balance, protected by the wisdom of those society too often overlooked. The day of their public revelation arrived with an unusual fog shrouding the diner. Joe's hands trembled slightly as he placed the quantum equations on table 7. Helen arranged her medical records while Pete organized his court documents. Bob stood by the window, watching as important figures from their community arrived. Dr. Chen led the university board members inside. Hospital administrators followed Dr. Thompson through the door. Judge Martinez arrived with a group of respected colleagues. Community leaders filled the remaining spaces, their faces curious but skeptical. May locked the door behind them and drew the blinds. The diner hummed with an energy that made everyone's skin tingle. The 4 tables, their quantum anchors, began to glow with a soft blue light. "Ladies and gentlemen," Joe began, his professor's voice steady despite his nerves. "What you're about to see may seem impossible. But I ask you to remember who we are. Remember our years of service, our dedication to this community. We wouldn't bring you here without reason." Suddenly, the diner's walls seemed to dissolve. The quantum anchors projected a vision of their city 10 years into the future. The guests gasped as they saw empty streets, automated services, and people isolated in their homes, all decisions made by Tomorrow Technologies' AI system. Hospital scenes showed patients being denied treatment based purely on statistical probabilities. Courtrooms displayed automated judgments that ignored human circumstances. Communities appeared fractured, with personal connections replaced by digital efficiency. But then something went wrong. The temporal window began to fluctuate wildly. May rushed to her grandfather's book, her face pale. "The system, it's detecting our interference. Tomorrow Technologies must have launched early." The figure materialized, its form unstable. "They're activating the system now. You have to make a choice, maintain the temporal bridges, or stop them. You can't do both." Joe looked at his friends. Decades of morning coffee had led to this moment. If they maintained their quantum anchors, they could preserve their connection to the future but would be powerless to stop Tomorrow Technologies. If they used their anchor's power to stop the system's activation, they would lose their temporal bridges forever. Helen reached across the table, taking Joe's hand. Pete and Bob nodded in agreement. They'd seen enough of the future to know what needed to be done. "Show them everything," Joe commanded. The 4 elderly friends focused their lifetime of experience, their wisdom, their understanding of human nature into the quantum anchors. The diner erupted with energy as they channeled every temporal connection into one massive surge. Across the city, Tomorrow Technology systems crashed. Their AI platform, moments from activation, went dark. The gathered leaders watched in awe as the future vision shifted, showing a new possibility, one where human wisdom and technological progress worked in harmony. The surge faded. The figure appeared one last time, smiling. "You chose well. The future is changing already. We're beginning to remember what it means to be human." As the figure faded forever, the guests sat in stunned silence. Then Dr. Chen stood up. "I think we all understand what needs to be done." The next few hours were a blur of action. Dr. Thompson drafted new hospital policies, preserving human judgment in medical decisions. Judge Martinez began writing guidelines requiring human oversight in legal proceedings. Community leaders planned initiatives to strengthen personal connections. Their quantum anchors would never again connect to the future. But as Joe looked at his friends Helen, Pete, and Bob, he knew they'd chosen correctly. Sometimes the wisest choice was letting go of power to preserve something more important, humanity's right to learn, grow, and decide its own future. The morning sun finally broke through the fog, casting warm light through the diner's windows. May brought them fresh coffee, and for the first time in weeks, it was just coffee, no temporal energy, no ripples in time. Just 4 friends sharing breakfast, knowing they'd done what needed to be done. The year had passed since that fateful morning at May's downtown diner. The familiar bell chimed as Joe pushed open the door, breathing in the comforting aroma of coffee and breakfast. Table 7 no longer hummed with temporal energy, but it held something just as powerful, memories of how 4 elderly friends had changed the course of history. He settled into his usual spot, smiling as Helen, Pete, and Bob arrived for their morning ritual. Their tables were just regular tables now, but their friendship had grown stronger through their shared experience. May brought their usual orders without asking, her grandfather's book safely stored away, its mission accomplished. The changes they'd set in motion had spread far beyond their small city. Dr. Chen's research on ethical AI development had gained international attention. Hospitals across the country had adopted Dr. Thompson's guidelines, ensuring human wisdom remained central to medical decisions. Judge Martinez's framework for preserving human judgment in legal proceedings had become a model for courts nationwide. "Did you see the news?" Bob asked, sliding a newspaper across the table. Tomorrow Technologies had reorganized, their new mission statement emphasizing the partnership between human experience and artificial intelligence rather than replacement. But their greatest victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small moments they witnessed every day. Doctors taking time to know their patients personally. Judges considering the full context of each case. Mail carriers maintaining those vital community connections. Teachers nurturing not just knowledge, but wisdom in their students. "You know," Helen said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "sometimes I miss those quantum anchors, the connection to the future. But then I look around this diner." They all understood what she meant. The place was alive with human interaction. Young professionals chatted with elderly regulars, sharing stories and experiences. Technology was present, laptops and smartphones on tables, but it didn't dominate. It served, rather than replaced, human connection. May joined them during her break, pulling up a chair. "My grandfather would be proud," she said softly. "Not just of what you did, but of what you helped people remember, that wisdom isn't something you can program. It has to be lived, shared, passed down." Joe watched a young student explaining something to an elderly patron at a nearby table, both learning from each other. This was their real legacy, not just preventing a future dominated by artificial judgment, but reminding people of the irreplaceable value of human experience. "We never did figure out who that figure from the future was," Pete mused. "Maybe it was everyone who remembered what it meant to be human," Bob suggested. "Everyone who refused to let wisdom be reduced to algorithms." As they finished their coffee, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across their tables. They were no longer guardians of temporal bridges or saviors of humanity's future. They were simply 4 friends who'd proven that age wasn't a limitation, it was an advantage. Their lifetimes of experience had given them the wisdom to recognize what needed to be preserved. Outside, the city pulsed with life, technology, and humanity working together rather than against each other. And in a small downtown diner, 4 elderly regulars continued their morning routine, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes start with something as simple as showing up, day after day, at the same time, at the same place, ready to share their wisdom with whoever needs it. May refilled their cups one last time. "Same time tomorrow?" They smiled, raising their coffee in a quiet toast. Some routines were worth keeping, not because they might save the future, but because they reminded everyone that human connection, understanding, and wisdom would always be worth preserving. The diner's bell chimed as new customers entered, and life went on a little wiser, a little more human, thanks to 4 elderly friends who refused to let experience be replaced by efficiency.